welcome to this webinar on employee ownership, and welcome to Peter Morris, who's going to be sharing his own experience on EO transition at Albert Hall, Monaghan and Morris. My name is Val King, and last March, my husband Pete and I sold the Roof Light company to our 70 employees via an employee ownership trust. And this March, 1 week before lockdown, I handed over the role of managing director to our ops director, Steve. And so you can imagine that Steve has had a baptism of fire in the last few months. And handling a pandemic wasn't exactly on his job description. But I'm pleased to say he's done a fantastic job and the business is doing well. Since March, I've set up a new business, BFG Associates, where I help people to find out whether or not employee ownership is right for them as an exit plan, and then support them through the transition to employee ownership using a project management tool. I'm now going to go through the running order of today. So what's going to happen is, as a member of the Employee Ownership Association Membership Council, I'm just going to give you a quick update on the sector, and then I'll hand over to Peter, who is going to speak about employee ownership before and after, the whys and the hows. And then during Peter's presentation, what I'd ask you to do is to type in any questions you have for Peter in the chat facility. There are too many people to actually be able to do this verbally. So what I'll be doing is taking note of all the questions that you ask, and then I'll ask Peter those questions for the final 20 minutes of the session. So again, if I can ask you to put all your mics on mute, that would be good. So I'm just going to share my screen now onto PowerPoint. Right. So today is EO Day, as Hannah from the EOA is in the audience as well. And that means that employee-owned businesses all over the country are celebrating, and usually there's a lot of cake involved. But what I'd like to share with you is statistics about the sector. And these are from a report which was carried out in 2019 by Leeds University. So in 2019, the EO sector had the largest growth in its history. More than 100 businesses became employee-owned. And so that shows a record growth of 28%. The report shows that there's been a quantum leap in the past 2 to 3 years. So we're really start of a big movement in the UK in the business sector. In terms of geography, London is where there are most EO businesses, followed by Scotland, where they're bidding to become a world leader in employee-owned businesses. As far as the makeup in terms of the professions, the professional services remains the largest subsector. Overall, it represents the largest group. And of the professional sector, architects make up quite a big chunk. So 41 architectural practices are members of the EOA. But obviously I know that in the audience we have some engineers, there are quite a lot of town planners, as well as other types of professions. So these are a selection of some of the architectural practices who are already employee-owned. And in the AG 100, 21 are employee-owned. And amongst them, we have Albert Hall, Monaghan and Morris, who are number 4 in the AG 100. And it just so happens this morning we have Peter, who is going to speak to you about before and after employee ownership. So I'll stop sharing now, Peter, and if you just you can start your presentation.
Thank you. Well, fingers crossed. Here we go. I'm going to go there, and hopefully you'll let me know you can see that. Great. Thank you very much. And thank you, Val, for that introduction. As it happens, AJ 100 have just announced their latest results, and we've moved up to 3. And I only say that not because size has ever been something that particularly matters to AHMM, genuinely, but because I will talk about size later in relation to bringing employee ownership into the practice and getting people to engage with it. So good morning, everyone. As you already know, I'm Peter Morris. I'm one of the 4 founders of AHMM. And Val's asked me to talk about employee ownership. This is actually a talk I pretty much gave to a built environment event hosted by the EO Forum by Arabs, actually, and as it happens, exactly 1 year ago today, I realised yesterday, Val, and how things have changed for us all since then. The 4 founders set up the practice 30 years ago, and we're now a little over 500 people with offices in London, Bristol, and weirdly in Oklahoma City. But like pretty much everyone else, our workforce has been widely dispersed from their homes over the past 3 months. And so we now find ourselves working ever harder to make sure that we continue working together. And working together, this is a phrase we coined right at the start of lockdown as a way of signalling the importance within the AHMM community of our shared role in helping one another through these uncharted and unique times. And so significant in the context of this talk, in which I'm going to explain why we decided to become majority employee owned just under 3 years ago. And if I'm honest, even 3 years on, it still feels like it's relatively early days and there's plenty to do in order to make employee ownership as embedded in the business as we would like it to be. However, presentations like today offer a really useful opportunity actually to take stock and a chance to reflect on where we've come from, where we are now, and where we might be going, as well as to revisit and share our experiences to date. So I'm first going to talk a little bit about the practical reasons behind our decision, in other words, why we chose employee ownership, before briefly touching on some of the technical aspects of how we set it up. I'll follow that by talking about why we felt employee ownership was a good fit for AHMM, before touching on where we are today, the challenges associated with our move, and how we plan to continue to make the most of being employee owned. So the 4 founders first started talking in earnest about our plans for the long-term future around 6 years ago. And in particular, given that we're all close in age, now in our late 50s, the possibility that we might choose to exit the business at a similar time, and the potential impact that could have on the practice financially, but also in terms of leadership. It's been a really key strength of our business and our relationship that we have always been equal owners, and in fact, equal in all respects, even if our individual roles have evolved over time. And all of this is based on a long-standing friendship, which we didn't want to upset just at the point when we might think about stepping back from the business, so at some point in the future. So for us, simplicity and ease of our future exit was really key to our thinking about this. And of course, succession was another factor that we were bearing in mind, given that we've got a few miles left in the tank. It was about giving ourselves the time and the right conditions to let this evolve at the right pace. This relied on the founders being able to make explicit, both within and without the practice, our long-term commitment to the business, while putting in place the conditions to enable new leadership to emerge over time, and so safeguarding the continued stability of the business during this transition period. Within the practice itself, this change was also about dealing with ownership, and I mean this in a number of senses. First, in the sense of the founders extracting some of the value embedded within the business, but without, for example, selling to a third party or via what we would have thought would be a countercultural and probably unaffordable management buyout. Second, in the sense of the founders no longer being seen as the proprietors. Since the practice was founded, those who've worked in it, however long they've stayed with us, have always talked to us about the business as being ours, the founders. The move to employee ownership would mean that in real terms, the practice would now be ours in total. An important distinction as we move forward, with the responsibility for acting as custodians of the practice and of its culture and its values now being shared by everyone rather than by a very small number. And third and finally, in the sense of allowing ownership to become distinct from leadership. By devolving ownership across the whole office rather than it being focused on the original owners or otherwise being passed on to a select few at a moment in time. And in that way, ownership and leadership become liberated from one another. And instead, leadership can emerge in the right place and the right time based on talent, skills, experience, and conduct. In terms of how we set things up, again, the key driver for us was to keep things as simple as possible, as well as financially sustainable in the future. And so our decision has been to move to there being no direct ownership beyond the founder's generation, with 100% of ownership being held by the trust on behalf of the employees in due course. In the first place, though, we transferred 60% of our shareholding into the trust, with the value of these shares to be paid out over a nominal 10-year period, not via a business loan, but out of the business itself. And this is underpinned and supported by a 10-year financial plan, key to which, despite what the history of the practice has shown us and what I said at the start of this talk, is that it assumes zero growth in the business beyond the starting point of the 10-year period. A deliberate move to avoid putting the practice under pressure to grow the business in order to afford the repayment plan any more than it chooses to of its own accord. And we've also made a suitable allowance within our plan for an annual distribution of profit share, such that the financial benefits of being employee owned are built in throughout the 10-year period for all employees. And of course, any business model is idealized and in reality susceptible to outside forces. So we've also been clear from the outset that payment against the shares may take longer than 10 years, or indeed might be speeded up according to circumstances, though I suspect the chances of speeding up are significantly diminished for the time being. The final element of our setup is that the remaining 40% shareholding, currently held equally between the four founders, will be gifted to the trust at the point that the 60% shareholding has been paid out, which, as I already mentioned, means that there will be zero direct ownership moving forward. This approach supports our central aim of ease of exit for the founders any time after the final transfer of ownership, because the matter of value and ownership has been dealt with in full, so eliminating any burden on the practice, or indeed any founders who choose to remain within the business. It also sets things up such that future changes in leadership will be unaffected by the matters of value and ownership. And instead, these decisions can be based on effective performance and the evolving needs of the business. In other words, a sustainable model into the future. And to complete the technical aspects of our transfer to employee ownership, in terms of our formal structure, we have an EOT board made up of 5 directors, with 2 of those being founders, 2 are employee directors, and alongside an independent chair, which in our case is Graham Nuttall, who may be known to several of you. This arrangement ensures, through the chair's casting vote, that the board reflects and protects the interests of the employees as 60% majority owners, with the 2 employee directors and the independent chair out of the 5. So I've run through the practical and the technical aspects of our decision to move to employee ownership, but the real fit between AHMM and employee ownership goes back to our roots as a business. And I thought this was worth touching on because I think it's important to hear the real stories behind businesses, number one, but also behind a decision like this to move towards employee ownership. And our roots as a business are now set out in what we call the founder statement, which was actually written after we became employee owned. And it now sits alongside the trust deed as a point of reference for the trustee board. And it's also published in the form of a small book. I know that's not very common these days to publish things, in time to be handed to all of our staff. And in fact, we managed to do that on the practice's 30th birthday, which was
on a video call, so I can't talk.
Somebody needs to mute themselves in the background. Okay. Architecture, alliance, and ambition form the 3 strands of our statement, summing up the nature of the practice: its purpose, its way of working, its culture, and its way of thinking about itself. And they also help explain why employee ownership and AHMM make a natural fit for one another. And of course, it was architecture, the first strand, which brought the 4 of us together in the first place, initially in pairs as degree students at Bristol and Sheffield universities, and later as 4 diploma students meeting at the Bartlett 35 years ago. How times have changed for the Bartlett and indeed for us. We were the only 4 non-Bartlett graduates in our year, and so we were naturally drawn together and formed a close friendship at an early stage. And in our final year, our focus moved towards those everyday buildings which form the backdrop to the city. And we devised a group project which saw the development of 4 office buildings and the public space they defined, which marked the beginnings of our collaboration. And leads me to the second strand of our founder's statement, which is alliance. With our diploma project providing the means by which we developed a way of working together. On the left is an early image showing the master plan we devised for our chosen site in Little Britain, which is coincidentally just down the road from our office in London today. And while this project was nominally about each of us designing a building, it was the nature of our collaboration and the process we set up for working alongside each other, an embryonic partnership, which was more interesting than the architectural outcome itself. A process in which each person took individual responsibility for the design of their own building, but shared a collective responsibility for the public spaces which the 4 buildings created around and between them. We developed an iterative process in which each made their own drawings, exploring the architecture of the 4 buildings before coming together for regular meetings when we would collage our drawings together in plan, section and perspective, allowing us to understand and discuss the impact of design decisions each of us was beginning to take, both on our own and on each other's buildings, but just as importantly on the city space we were collectively beginning to define, and so allowing us to go away and make further iterations in response to what we saw. A kind of honest and explicit negotiation on the basis of visual evidence, leading to an increasingly committed approach to the emerging project, later encapsulated by the axiom, if it's not drawn, it can't be discussed. And so while we ended up with 4 building proposals, which of course was a prerequisite of achieving our diploma, it turned out that the process of negotiation around a shared ambition, which had evolved throughout that process, was the really important bit. Each one of us taking on individual areas of responsibility, our buildings, in pursuit of a collective endeavour, the public space between us. And so the genesis of the practice we went on to set up just 3 years later. So while our early partnership applied to 4 people and the design of buildings in the city, it was and remains analogous to how we think about our practice today. Now a very much larger group, working within a culture which believes in strong leadership, coupled with an explicit collaborative working method. A method which depends first on each person taking on individual areas of responsibility in pursuit of a collective endeavour. Second, on the mutual respect and interdependence which this implies. And third, on the understanding that the best ideas will be pursued based on their merits and not on their authorship. An approach which is equally valid at the individual project level, where we strive to create buildings of quality, as at the practice level, where we continuously aim to improve how we run our business. And equally at the board level, where we act as leaders of the business, but also custodians of its values and ambitions. Which brings me to the third strand of our founder statement, which makes clear that while architecture will always be at the forefront of what we do as a business, the quality of what we do in support of making architecture is just as important. In other words, our ambition to continue to make the best architectural work we can and to continuously improve this relies on our ambition to create and evolve the best practice we can in all senses of that word. Our practice is a design project all of its own and one which never ends, and which relies on effective collaboration, and now at a significant scale and to a very high degree of complexity. So that was a short history of a long partnership and explains why we feel employee ownership fits as well. But as for how to make the most of being employee owned, I'm going to start by putting our plans into the context of what's happened so far. I said earlier that we're at an early stage of being employee owned and we've had our challenges, which I'm sure is as much as anything about the scale of the practice we now are. In particular, finding the right balance between communication is a continuous challenge, let alone increasing engagement among employees. I explained before that the founders were pretty clear that employee ownership was the right choice for the practice. And while I can fully understand why other businesses might decide otherwise, we chose to limit the extent of our consultation about the move to employee ownership to the most senior members of the practice. But it provided an important opportunity to explain our reasoning and to take soundings, especially on the implications of our decision to work towards zero direct ownership, something which would affect them directly, which clearly might therefore have been a concern for some of them. But I'm glad to say that the feedback we received was universally positive about the approach we were adopting and the thinking behind it, and so only gave us confidence in taking the process forward. For the majority of our employees then, when we announced that we were moving to majority employee ownership, this was a fait accompli, but was nonetheless well received. And the corollary of choosing to consult in a limited way in the run-up to our transition was that we decided not to implement any structures or processes before making the announcement, but to maximize the opportunity for all employees to directly influence these next steps once announced. And the first of these was to arrange for the selection of our 2 employee directors, which we did by inviting applications, although chose to restrict the pool who could apply to our senior team, associates and upwards, which we felt was appropriate given the desire to bring a tried and tested degree of experience to the inaugural trustee board. As you can see, we received 8 applications, following which we then held a public vote, as a result of which our 2 directors were elected. Each of whom won a significant proportion of the votes, making them clear favourites, which is always a good thing. And also a good thing, given the composition of the executive board, which is all men. I'm pleased to say that both of them are women, one an architect and one a member of the support team, one based in London and one based in Bristol. And since being elected just over 2 years ago, Morna and Kerry have developed a number of initiatives for facilitating employee engagement. First, this page on our intranet dedicated to the EOT, which includes news items, past presentations, and a range of other useful documents. You can see the link there to the EOA, for example. And one of those documents is this one, which is EOT in a nutshell, which aims to explain in relatively plain English, and with diagrams, as you can see, the nature of being employee-owned and the purpose and aspirations of the trustee board at AHMM and its employee directors. Kerry and Morna have also developed this document, Make a Proposition, which provides everyone with guidelines on how to bring forward suggestions to the trustee board, including the need to document that suggestion so that it can be properly assessed. A more recent example, if you like, of the axiom from our student days, if it's not drawn, it can't be discussed. And alongside all of this, Kerry and Morna have put in place quarterly open forums in each of our 3 office locations, open to all employees to attend, and where anyone is able to put forward items for the agenda. Perhaps unsurprisingly, one of the early areas of discussion within these forums has been in response to our gender pay gap report, with the first of our businesses reports coming out around the time of the appointment of our 2 employee directors a couple of years ago. This directly led to the formation of a gender pay gap working group made up of a broad cross-section of employees and led by one of our associates who has now taken on the role of gender equality champion. And that group has worked with our HR team to develop a clearer understanding of the nature and meaning of the gender pay gap within our business. And they have since issued a comprehensive and wide-ranging 60-page report to the trustee board containing their analysis and their recommendations. This itself led to the development of a 16-point action plan, since presented to and approved by the executive board and now being implemented by the practice in earnest. For me, this is a really good example of a formal proposition coming forward directly from employees. But we are aware that not everyone will feel comfortable putting together a formal proposition, and that we need to find ways of anyone being able to do that at whatever scale and however modest the topic. And to reinforce this point, attendance at the forums has been very varied, along with the feedback we've received. These diagrams approximate to the relative headcount in each of our 3 offices, and especially interesting to note, therefore, that we've typically had an attendance at our open forums of around 10% of our headcount in London, around 50% in Bristol, and more or less 100% turnout in Oklahoma. And we've also had some feedback from these forums that there's a perception that it can take too long for anything concrete to happen, and more generally, not enough communication. And so there's a danger of people becoming skeptical about the forum's purpose and potential benefits. So learning from that, we recognise the need to demonstrate more clearly that issues raised are being heard and feedback offered, whether positive or not, along with action where appropriate. In an effort to address this, Morna and Kerry put in place a working group to support them in the work of engaging with as wide a spectrum of employees as possible. And this was the invitation to apply to that group, and everyone and anyone was eligible to submit an application to join the group, because we were keen to attract as diverse a cross-section of the office as possible. The only proviso being that anyone interested was asked to submit a written application setting out their understanding of employee ownership, along with how they believed they could increase communication and engagement within the business. We received 22 applications from across the offices, and while we originally planned for a group of 12, the quality of submissions was so high and the commitment shown within them so clear that Kerry and Morna ended up inviting 15 people to join the group. So, going back to those diagrams, simplistic though they undoubtedly are, it's easy to see how the ability to engage with such a large number of people can be difficult for 2 people, let alone the time it takes them. And while we recognise that not everyone will be interested in getting involved in EO, the working group has already significantly increased engagement around all of our offices. And working together as a group takes us right back to the idea of the individual taking on responsibility in the pursuit of the collective endeavour. And so perhaps closer to the essence of AHMM when it was fewer people, enabling the dynamic of smaller practice to exist within larger practice, though in this case in the form of, let's say, neighbourhoods. And we're still pushing to achieve a more effective cycle in our communication so that employees know to expect a response when their ideas are shared, and so help that feedback loop to become both valued and trusted. And this tracker device has been developed by the group as a means to do so, and is already making a difference. And only serves to highlight that we need to continually repeat our messaging and reinforce the central message of our employee ownership, the principle of individual responsibility in the pursuit of collective endeavour, which relies on valuing and understanding not just your own role, but that of others around you. so the new employees who join the practice from time to time know that these principles are integrated into the creation of our architecture and the success of our business. Our original working partnership was made up of 4 students, each designing their own building and sharing responsibility for the public realm within a city block. Our practice, as it has evolved over the last 30 years, has been the extension of that principle, where the founders have been custodians of the common ground between us, that common ground being our ambition for the practice and for the work it produces. And now, as an employee-owned organisation, while leadership remains an important part of running the business, every employee owner at AHMM has the opportunity, however long they choose to remain with us, to contribute to the community they form part of, whether within their local neighbourhood and the projects they're working on, or at a city scale as citizens of AHMM. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Peter. I wonder if you could ask you to stop sharing. That's great. Righty, so I've got some really good questions to ask Peter, and thank you so much for that insightful. It was great to hear the human side of AHMM, as well as the whole story about transitioning to employee ownership. And it's great to hear sometimes that it's hard to get everything right and get everybody engaged, especially with such a large practice. So I have the first question from Jonathan. Is the independent trustee chair paid?
Sorry, is he what?
Is he paid?
Is he paid? No, he's not. No, he's not paid. Well, sorry, he's paid for his time, but nothing more than that. So he doesn't get a kind of a salary of any sort or a regular remuneration, but simply for attending what's usually a 2-hour quarterly meeting. We have actually chosen to invite Graham along to a number of other events, including design reviews, for example, so that would give him a better insight of how architectural practice operates, and we tend to pay him for his time. He's a lawyer, that's what happens with lawyers, but we do so because we choose to and because we know that it only adds to his understanding of our business and therefore his ability to act on our employees' behalf.
Good, thanks. And from our point of view, we have 6 trustees and 3 of them are independent, and we do actually pay them as well.
Yeah.
So that it is usual to pay the independent trustees. Also, Jonathan is asking, is the trustee board separate from the executive board? Yeah,
sorry, I didn't show slides about that and perhaps could have done, but yes, they are independent, but clearly there is an overlap. I'm on both. I'm on the executive board, I'm managing director, I'm also on the trustee board, as is now Paul Monaghan. It was Simon Alford for the first 2 years, but we've just had that transition or handover. I think we felt it was important that the founders rather, were fully represented on that board, not least because we're in the middle of our 10-year repayment plan of the value of the shares. But I think, you know, it's a neat fit, let's say, between the 60% shareholding and the fact that we have 2 employee directors alongside an independent chair. But ultimately, the independent chair is there to make independent decisions, whether he believes, you know, if there is a kind of, let's say, a tussle between the founders and the employee representatives, that will be, as it were, ironed out by the independent chair. We've never reached that point. We've always had very consensual conversations and managed to reach good decisions between us.
And so there's never a conflict between being on the executive board and on the trustee board.
Well, in a way, yeah. Is there a conflict? Well, I think essentially that's why I reinforced the point about the relative proportions. You know, the voting proportions, which are 40-60 between founders and others. But ultimately, we are all there to support the making good decisions for the practice. I think it's probably worth saying, I'm not sure that this may be a later question anyway, but I'll say it here in this context, that when we first, so Graham Nuttall, many of you will know, was involved in writing the Nuttall report, I think it was called, which essentially led to the formation of the Employee Ownership Trust as an entity, a specific entity, and everything that goes with that. And so he was somebody we spoke to at a relatively early stage in our journey in looking into employee ownership. And he was, of course, everyone has lots of questions about what does this mean and what will it look like. And I think it's important to say that it will be very different for different kinds of organisations. Ours has always been one where, as I think I emphasised throughout my presentation, where strong leadership is important. That's not to say you don't listen to other people. That's to say that any collaboration needs somebody who ultimately makes a decision on behalf of that group who are collaborating to move things forward. And Graham was clear to us from the start that a trustee board is not there to is there to kind of keep an eye on, to scrutinise the actions of the executive board, but not to do their job for them. So the executive board remains the trusted runners of the business, but they are and do report back to the trustee board in terms of big decisions that are being taken. So for examples of that would be when we set our annual budget within the executive board, we share that what that is and why we've come to that decision with the trustee board, and essentially we're looking for their approval, though I don't think we actually need them to approve it, but clearly we would rather that was the case. So that would be one example where we are kind of using the trustee board to act as a sounding board, if you like, a critical friend for decisions the executive board are taking. But I think, you know, our interests are all ultimately, well, I would say this wouldn't I, but our interests are shared. Ultimately, we have common interests.
And I think that's one of the major advantages of employee ownership, because most of the time people are looking at the best interest of the business, not just their individual personal gain. Another question, Nathan is asking, how much does each employee own and what is the percentage ownership?
Okay, well, I mean, it's the simple answer is it depends how many employees there are at a moment in time, because essentially it's diluted in an equal way across all employees, however many exist at any moment in time. So because it's not direct ownership, in other words, they are indirectly owners of the business through the trust, which acts on their behalf, effectively nobody would have a specific percentage of ownership. They are just part of a group, all of whom, through being employees, are indirectly owners of 60% of the business. So you could probably calculate it on a day of the week, but it's sort of slightly meaningless because of this distinction between direct and indirect ownership. And just in case anybody is unclear about that, so for example, as a founder, if you recall, I talked about there being 40% ownership retained by the founders, with which I continue to own a quarter. So I personally have a 10% direct ownership of the business still, direct ownership of shares in the business. As an employee, though, actually, I am an employee as a director. I also am a shareholder within the trust, and that owns 60% of the shares of the business. So I have access through that trust to my ownership, but not direct access to that ownership.
And can I just say, Peter, when we met at the Employee Ownership Association conference, you helped Pete and me, my husband Pete and me, to decide on the 60%, because the minimum in order to have capital gains tax exemption is 51%.
Exactly.
And so we thought, well, 51% seems a bit mean. What would be the right amount? And we ended up with 6%, just like you. So we sold 60% to the Employee Ownership Trust, and then the trust is held for the benefit of the beneficiaries, who are the employees.
Exactly.
So another question, Scott is asking, is there a difference in the employment culture in the US and the UK, as it seems there is more buy-in in the US with a higher participation? So that's the first question.
It's a good question. I'm not sure if I can honestly answer that. I think I can only answer that in terms of my sense of them as a bunch of people who I've met a couple of times, because it's a long way away. I've been to that office, I think it's twice now, maybe 3 times. And they're a much smaller office than the London one. And I suppose I may not have said this directly, I think I alluded to it, but the scale of a group of people, I think, of course, has a big impact on the ability to engage or feel a part of something in a particular kind of way. So in Oklahoma, that's about 12 people at the moment. In Bristol, it's about 60 who are more or less in a one room. In London, it's obviously much more distributed than that because it's nearer to 400 or plus. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure that our OKC office, therefore, is particularly different in terms of how it thinks about employee ownership than the UK offices in any other way, except that they are a smaller group of people who know each other more easily and spend more time together. Actually, if I'm perfectly honest, I don't think it goes much beyond that. There are differences, obviously, in employment practice in the US, generally negative, I would say, compared to those in the UK. But we try to equalise that through how we set things up.
And I just want to build and communicate the employee's role. Scott is also asking.
Sorry, I missed that.
How does one build and communicate the employee's role? Is that as an owner, I guess?
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the things that we've found most challenging, and I would say we aren't there yet. I talked about it feels quite slow paced, but I think I'm sure everybody in the this virtual room is the same, but we're a busy organisation where most people are spending most of their time focusing on the job in hand. That's number one. And that's where kind of their priorities are. So actually, we've tried very hard to kind of find ways of getting engagement going, and it goes back to that scale thing. So my point about only 10% of the London office turning up to forums is, I think, a very clear acknowledgement of the, not anonymity, but the different social structures which exist, let's say, within a very large group of people versus in a much smaller group of people. So even that way of kind of just talking about what employee ownership might mean and what it might be to be an employee owner probably means different things in different places. And the employee, the working group I mentioned of 15 employees, that's totally about trying to get more direct communication with smaller groups of people to try and encourage them. I suppose to a degree, though, if I'm honest, I think I also said that it's about people's appetite for engaging. We can't force that on people, nor would we want to. I think from day one, we've talked about employee ownership, not as a kind of revolution necessarily, but about an evolution. And a well-worn phrase, I know, but it's true in that we're not saying on the day people became employee-owned, their world's changed. We're saying that over time it will allow our world of AHMM to evolve into a new form of ownership and leadership, and that isn't going to happen overnight. And just to kind of reinforce that point, for example, often one of the biggest fillip to members of staff when one becomes employee owned is their access to profit share, and we'd actually decided to introduce that about 4 years before we became employee owned. So that wasn't, we couldn't even hold that up and say, look what you've got now. What we were able to do though was, which is fantastic, is to because of the tax-free element of profit or bonus sharing with up to £3,600, that makes a big difference to a large number of our staff when it comes to the profit share moment, because they get that essentially tax-free.
It's a big bonus. 3,600 of tax-free is a big incentive for people, especially in our manufacturing company, for people who aren't earning as much as others.
Sorry, I'm just going to add, sorry, briefly. I think the other point is, and again, I think maybe many people in this meeting are from architectural practice backgrounds. I don't know if it's exclusively that, but I think we all know though that the reason people are interested within about the topic of employee ownership, particularly within architecture, is because there's a kind of, I talked about our particular fit with it. That's clearly not unique to AHMM by any stretch of the imagination. We are a profession of collaboration, and who look to work with people around us. We're also, I think, a profession who tend to be optimistic in their outlook, as a matter of course. And so I think those things combined kind of makes us an absolutely natural fit for employee ownership. And so my point being, in terms of trying to help people to understand what that means to them, they're already living it in many ways, I think, as architects in practice. I think that's my point.
That natural collaboration. So the next question is from Tom. Do employees within an EO scheme carry any additional liability in relation to the business that they wouldn't otherwise carry? So is there additional liability as an employee in the scheme that you have, which is the trust?
No. There's no difference between any employee before and after becoming an employee-owned business. The liability, and we're a limited company, so ultimately it's dealt with within that entity anyway. So no, there's no difference at all. I mean, I think the nearest there is to liability is for us as directors of the board who have our usual fiduciary duties, but any other member of staff is just literally that they're an employee who happens to be an owner, so it doesn't have any impact there.
I think if you become a director of the board of trustees, then it's better to have insurance, and that's what you provide for our employee directors.
You do. Well, actually, that's interesting. We don't do that, so I'll take a note of that and come back on that one.
might be something, I don't know. So the next question is from Fergus. How did you find your independent trustees? Or in your case, yes, how did you find your independent trustees?
Meaning Graham, the chair, is that?
Yes.
Okay, well, I think I touched on that just now, so maybe I've covered this one, but essentially Graham was already advising us on the whole process of transition to becoming an employee owned business. And actually, what I will just say here is that I was leading this project, not surprisingly, as managing director, and I think I've been talking about it with our accountants for probably a good year or two in broad principle, and I just knew we didn't quite have this kind of insight we needed to really understand what this was about, at which point I contacted Graham, and suddenly and there are others, let me be clear, who can offer similar advice to Graham, but that kind of completely lifted the veil from my eyes, because I was able to get really direct responses to what it all means, what are the mechanics, what are the, what are the technicalities, and so on. So Graham was a really fantastic support, one I paid for, of course, we paid for, but a really fantastic support in our understanding of what we were moving towards, and ultimately the decision to go with it. And it seemed a natural fit at the end of all that when we were considering our board to ask him if he'd be prepared to sit on it, and I'm very glad to say he said yes.
Great, thank you for that. From Richard, good morning Richard. I think the real strength of the future vision is the acknowledgement of zero growth, but for how long do you feel, Peter, this can be maintained, and what if hard time required hard measures?
So zero growth is, I think I've already said, that was a model, a financial model, to avoid putting pressure on us to grow other than when we felt it was appropriate. And actually in the last 2 years, 2 years since becoming employee, and of course but we have happened to have grown actually quite significantly. And I might just say, and I kind of again mentioned it earlier, that AHMM's growth is in response to opportunity, not in response to kind of some targets at the end of the year that we're desperately trying to meet. And our history, generally speaking, with a blip in 2008, has been one of growth. I think we all know though that we're not, well, we know that we don't know what we're heading into at the moment, but I think we suspect that it's going to be quite tough in the next 6 to, let's say, 18 to 24 months. No one quite knows if and how things will bounce back. If we have to do the opposite of growth, we have to consider some level of shrinkage. I mean, the way we've always tried to handle difficult times in the past is to avoid taking any absolute action ourselves, but to allow the natural movement of people, which happens again, especially to scale it like ours, when people make the decision to move back home, wherever that might be, outside the UK or whatever, or move on to university. And that, to a degree, is we've managed with that when we've had moments of kind of loss of workload, let's say, in the past. That's happened 2 or 3 times in the intervening period. Were we to be in a position where we had to make some more difficult decisions, of course, I think one of the things we would want to do, being employee owned, is we always share quite a lot of business information, number one. So I talk to the office twice a year about as an executive board member, about the status of the business, about how we're performing and whether we're in a good state or not. And of course, I would do that more regularly if it was needed. And you can imagine in the last 3 months that there's been a lot of need for communication to keep people feeling secure, that things are stable, that they don't need to worry, that they can kind of do their best to carry on with their work from their homes and so on. But should that prove to should it get to the point where things are more strained, I think we would already have shared that fact that we were heading that direction if that's what we felt. And at the right time, I think we would be talking to employees about our options at that point. And options clearly might range from whether we would have to, and this is not because it's on our radar at the moment, but thinking in principle here, that if one ended up saying we need to reduce headcount, then you would have options between redundancy program at one end, voluntary redundancy being the starting point of that, to considering people saying, well, look, we're all happy to work a 4-day week and take a cut in salary. That would be another, or whatever, that would be another way. And to actually share that decision through the EO trustee board would seem to be an appropriate and a really important part of what being employee is about.
Excellent. Thanks for that. Next question is from James. Good morning, James. How do you differentiate and police the different terms of reference between the trust and the leadership boards?
So how do you differentiate the different
terms of reference? And
well, okay, I'll have a go at that. I mean, I think essentially the executive board are there to run the business in the way that any executive board would be expected to do that, and have all of the responsibilities that go with the day-to-day management of that business, making decisions both looking far ahead and also in the near term. So the whole strategy piece and everything that goes with it. And that's no different, I think, whether you are in our case, that is no difference before being employee owned and post being employee owned. And we've been explicit from the start that the executive board continues to be, that's their job, that's what they're there to do. And in time to come, that executive board will not be 4 founders, and in our case, a finance director, the 5th director, but it will be replaced by others, whoever they may be. And as I've already said, once the ownership has been dealt with finally and totally, and there is no direct ownership within the business, all the more so that then becomes the kind of the opportunity to pass the baton from generation to generation, where everybody is always acting on behalf of the best interest of the business as an executive board member in the future. So that's running the business. The trustee board are, as we see it, they're the critical friend to that other board. They're not there to fiddle or to get involved. They are there to be asked their advice. They are there to be said, we're going to make this decision. We want to share it with you. Do you think it's in the best interests of our employees that we do so? Because ultimately, the trustee board, I suppose the terms of reference for them are to ensure that the business continues to be run for the benefit of its shareholders, and those are the employees. And I think the related part goes back to the founder's statement, is that it continues to be operate and make decisions in the spirit of its ethos and the way in which the trust board was set up. That's why the founder statement and the trust deed itself are so important, because they kind of establish what the core values of the business are by which it should be run. And that's the kind of touchstone for the current executive board and for future executive boards. And of course, the four founders sort of determined from day one what that was going to be, and it's evolved over 30 years. So that's why it's been encapsulated into what we call the founder statement, and it's there for future generations. Not to say it can't change down the line or evolve, but the core of it is set.
Thanks for that. And we have more questions than time, but I'm going to touch on a couple more questions before we end. John is asking, could you expand on the tax exemption just mentioned regarding the 51% ownership?
Yeah, so essentially, if you want to become an employee ownership trust rather than an employee benefit trust, which I think still exists, Val, then you have to, on day one, relinquish or sell or pass on the majority of the shareholding. So 51% would be the majority, 50 wouldn't be the majority. So you always have to go above 50%. If you do that, then you are eligible, providing the Inland Revenue HMRC accept your story, your process, I'll maybe come back to that, then you're eligible for zero capital gains tax on the cost, on the value of the share transfer. So whatever the amount that's agreed for the majority of shares, 51 upwards, that you're selling to the trust, that value realizes no capital gains tax over, whenever it's paid out ultimately. So that's obviously a huge incentive for companies to consider employee ownership trust rather than employee benefits trust. And it leads to the idea that the employees are the majority shareholders. That's the key point here. And I suppose it signs a future intention, and in our case, a definite intention, to move towards an increasingly large majority, if not 100% ownership of the business, which is ultimately about reinforcing the value of employee ownership over personal/direct ownership.
Thank you. Tim is asking, does being an employee board trustee attract a salary uplift, and how is profit shared? And then second question, I'll start with the first one. Does being an employee board trustee attract a salary uplift?
So we've decided not to do that. Other than, no, we decided not to do that. I think you're able to make your own decision about that. So I think you'd obviously have to be transparent about it if you did. But we decided that it was an important part of the employee's role, if you like, already. Of course, if there are things like expenses, all that sort of stuff, you'd be covering that, and any training that was required for anybody who needed to be helped to understand what it was to act as a director of a board. So no is the answer. Sorry, what was the second part?
The second one is, how is profit share decided?
Well, so again, I think the rules within employee ownership are very, especially the trust version of it, are very clear, which is that you can only have two variables in how you calculate the profit share. And I explain, and it's not complicated in our case. It's that the first variable is the percentage of, ours, let me step back. Our profit share is based on a salary, percentage of salary. That's how we approach it. So if your salary is £20,000, then we apply a percentage to that, and we apply the same percentage if your salary is £50,000. So in other words, we're sort of reflecting, I think we're continuing to reflect the value to the business at a moment in time, both through salary and through the profit share that is attached to it. So there's a direct and proportional relationship. So going back to the rules, the first variable in that case would be what is the percentage you choose to set as the percentage of salary. and the second variable is, oh, I've now forgotten. My mind's gone blank. Maybe that's it, actually. Maybe that's the key.
It has to be on equal terms, and so
That's
that,
it.
that
Yeah,
percentage
that's right.
has to be the same.
Exactly. Sorry, I think I said maybe it's one equal. Maybe it's one variable. Actually, I'll come back to you on that one. My mind's gone slightly blank on it. Essentially, it's rather like the John Lewis thing. There's a percentage is announced in November in our case each year, and that applies to people's salary. And you know, and of course it can vary. It can go up. It can go down. And who knows what will happen this year, for example.
Yes, I think everyone's thinking about that question. So the final question, and what I'll do is there are more questions to be answered, but I don't want to go over time, or in fact we are already over time. So one more question and then I'll end the webinar. So this is from Rosita. Good morning, Rosita. At which point did you tell your employees about your EO plans? And then how prepared were you in the background?
Yeah. Okay. So I kind of did touch on this in the talk, but essentially we left it until we made the decision. Essentially, I think it was about 3 days before we were going to effectively press the button and become employee owned in terms of telling the whole office. But we did consult with our senior team. That's the most senior members of the practice, below director level, heads of department, associate directors, and so on, to explain to them what our plans were and why. And that probably took place over a good year plus before, in fact, probably more like 18 months before the transition. But we chose to kind of keep it tight like that because we ultimately we knew that we were clear in our minds that this was the right way forward. And I think I again said in my presentation that different people may choose to do this differently. I completely understand why some people might open the conversation about this up at a very early stage to get input and feedback. But I think the numbers at AHMM, partly this, are so large that we felt that wasn't necessarily appropriate. And we were also clear, having spent quite a long time in the run up to even talking to Graham about this, about talking about the options. Indeed, before EOTs as a form actually existed. So, you know, we'd had a long run into this, and we're therefore very clear in our minds. Different companies, different organizations will have different approaches to this, but that was our approach. So literally on the Wednesday, I stood up in front of the 500 people, either really or virtually, and explained what and why in a lot of detail. Then I went through, as architects often do, using lots of diagrams to help explain my words. And what's a trustee board, all that sort of stuff, to try and explain as much as I could, and followed it up in writing as well. And and then 3 days later, we signed on the dotted line.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. What I'd like to do is to suggest that I've saved the chats, and there might be some, I don't know if you've got any additional time, Peter, at some point, but I think it's better to keep to the timing more or less. And then I see some of the questions I think that I can answer, and certainly Hannah from the EOA can answer as well. And then we can send those answers to everybody who's participated today. In addition to that, if you want to receive a recording of the presentation, that's absolutely fine. We can send that out to all the participants. But what I'd like to do is just to signpost you to some information on employee ownership, and I will do that just now. So what I'd like to just tell you about is the next webinar that is going to be concentrating on the legal aspects of employee ownership. That's in 2 weeks' time. Then on the 24th of July, I'll be talking about our transition process from a project management point of view. And then financial aspects of preparing for transition is on the 14th of August. So we will be sending out invitations for that from next week onwards. Finding out more about employee ownership, the Employee Ownership Association is a great store of information for everything to do with EO. And then on my own website, there are lots of information on articles and blogs associated with succession planning as well as employee ownership. And then you can find contact details if you wanted to discuss employee ownership for your own practice. So what I'd like to do is to obviously thank Peter very much for a great insight into how you prepared, and then through the transition and post-transition. And to say thank you very much to everyone who's come along today, and happy weekend, everyone. Hopefully the sun will continue to shine. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye now.
Thanks for your questions.